February 14th, 2026, the Pentagon, 9:47 a.m. A three-star admiral walks into the office of the Chief of Naval Operations carrying a single sheet of paper. The document bears the seal of the White House. It contains one directive. The next class of guided missile frigates will be designated the Trump class. The admiral sets the paper on the desk. The CNO reads it twice. Then he picks up a secure phone and calls the Secretary of the Navy. That call lasts 11 minutes, and by the time it ends, the most serious civil-military confrontation of the Trump presidency is already in motion. Not over Iran, not over Taiwan, not over defense spending, over a name. I'm your host at Navy Sea Power, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're examining something that sounds trivial on the surface, but cuts to the bone of how the United States military actually functions. The question of who gets to name a warship, and why the answer nearly fractured the relationship between the White House and the Pentagon at the worst possible time. Because in February 2026, the United States Navy did something it almost never does. It said no to the Commander-in-Chief, publicly. To understand why a ship's name matters, you need to understand what a warship actually is, not as a weapons platform, not as a hull number in a fleet register, as an institution. USS Constitution, launched in 1797, still commissioned, the oldest warship afloat in the world. Her name wasn't an accident. The Founding Fathers chose it deliberately, a floating reminder that the Navy serves the document, not the man. That principle has guided ship naming for over 2 centuries. Aircraft carriers are named for presidents, not because presidents are popular, because the carrier is the most powerful single weapon system on Earth, and naming it for a head of state signals national authority. USS Nimitz, USS Eisenhower, USS Ford. Each name carries the weight of an era. Submarines carry state names, Ohio class, Virginia class. The logic is geographic. A submarine operates unseen, defending territory that belongs to all Americans. When you name a submarine USS Texas or USS California, you're telling 100 million people that their state has a stake in the deep ocean. Destroyers carry the names of heroes, sailors and Marines who gave their lives in combat. USS Cole, named for Sergeant Darrell Cole, who destroyed 2 Japanese machine gun positions on Iwo Jima before being killed by a grenade. When the Cole was struck by a suicide bomber in Yemen in 2000, killing 17 sailors, the name gained a second layer of sacrifice. These aren't bureaucratic labels. They're institutional DNA. And in February 2026, the White House moved to rewrite that DNA overnight. The Constellation-class frigate program had been in development since 2020, based on the Italian FREM design, adapted for American combat systems. Displacement, 7,300 tons. Length, 496 feet. SPY-6 radar, 32 vertical launch cells for SM-2 and SM-6 missiles, an embarked MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, a hull designed for anti-submarine warfare in contested littoral waters. The Navy had already named the first 4 ships: USS Constellation, USS Congress, USS Chesapeake, USS Lafayette, all names drawn from the original 6 frigates authorized by the Naval Act of 1794. The symbolism was deliberate. A new generation of frigates honoring the first generation. Then, on February 12th, 2026, the White House issued an executive memorandum directing the Secretary of the Navy to redesignate the frigate class. The Constellation class would become the Trump class. Future ships in the program would carry names selected by a presidential advisory panel. The memorandum cited precedent. The President, as Commander-in-Chief, has ultimate authority over military matters. Ship naming, while traditionally handled by the Secretary of the Navy, falls within executive prerogative. Legally, the argument had merit. The Secretary of the Navy's naming authority comes from 10 U.S. Code, Section 8721. But the President appoints the Secretary, and the President can issue directives to any executive branch official. Politically, the timing was no accident. The United States was 5 weeks into a naval confrontation with Iran in the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz had been contested since mid-January, when IRGC fast boats began aggressive intercepts of commercial tankers. 2 carrier strike groups, the Lincoln and the Truman, were deployed in the Arabian Sea. American sailors were operating under heightened rules of engagement. The President's approval ratings on defense had climbed to 58%, the highest of his second term. A senior White House advisor, speaking on background to 3 separate news outlets, described the naming directive as a way to cement the President's legacy as the leader who rebuilt American naval power. The advisor pointed to the administration's push for a 355-ship Navy, the acceleration of the frigate program, and the ongoing confrontation with Iran as justification. The Pentagon received the memorandum at 6:15 a.m. on February 12th. By 8 a.m., it had been read by every 4-star officer in the building. By noon, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Raymond Gallagher, had drafted a formal response. Not a press release, not a tweet. A 5-page memorandum addressed directly to the Secretary of Defense. The memo's subject line read, "Institutional Integrity of Warship Naming Conventions." Sources who reviewed the document described it as measured but unequivocal. Admiral Gallagher laid out the complete history of naming conventions. He cited every instance where a president had attempted to influence ship names, and every instance where the Navy had resisted. The historical record was more complex than most Americans realized. Franklin Roosevelt personally intervened to name an aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea, overriding Navy preferences. Lyndon Johnson pressured the Navy to name a carrier for his political mentor, Carl Vinson, while Vinson was still alive, which broke another tradition. In 1974, Admiral Hyman Rickover went directly to Congress to ensure a submarine was named USS Los Angeles, over the objections of the Secretary of the Navy. And in 2004, Congress passed legislation directing the Navy to name a submarine USS Jimmy Carter. The Navy complied, but internal memos from the period show deep institutional discomfort. A Virginia-class submarine carrying the name of a president. It violated the state naming convention that had governed the attack submarine fleet for decades. Each of these episodes created friction, but none of them involved renaming an entire class. That was the distinction Admiral Gallagher drew. Individual ships had been named for political reasons before. Naming a class, the designation that would define every ship in a multi-decade production run, was categorically different. It would stamp one man's identity on a platform that might serve for 50 years under 10 different presidents. The memo was classified. It was intended to remain inside the Pentagon. It leaked within 4 hours. By 5 p.m. on February 12th, 3 major news outlets had published excerpts. The Navy's senior uniformed officer had formally objected to a direct presidential directive. In writing, on the record, the fallout was immediate and bifurcated. Conservative media framed it as insubordination, an unelected military officer defying the elected commander-in-chief. Progressive media framed it as principled resistance, the military protecting institutional norms from political interference. Neither frame captured the full picture. Because the real crisis wasn't about a name. It was about civil-military relations, at a moment when those relations were already under extraordinary strain. The Iranian confrontation had created a command environment unlike anything since the early days of the Iraq War. Operational decisions in the Persian Gulf were being made at compressed timelines. Rules of engagement had been revised 3 times in January alone. The CENTCOM commander, General Patricia Voss, was in daily direct communication with the White House. bypassing the normal chain through the Joint Chiefs. Inside the Pentagon, the naming dispute became a proxy for a deeper anxiety. If the White House could override 2 centuries of tradition on something as symbolic as ship names, what else might it override? Targeting authority? Rules of engagement? Deployment decisions? This wasn't paranoia. It was institutional pattern recognition. Admiral Gallagher's memo included a section titled Downstream Effects on Force Cohesion. He argued that renaming the frigate class that would create a morale problem aboard the ships themselves. Sailors identify with their ship's name. The crew of USS Constellation had already formed. They wore the name on their uniforms. They had a motto, a crest, a culture built around that identity. Stripping that away and replacing it with a political name, any political name, would fracture unit cohesion at the crew level. The admiral also raised a diplomatic concern. Frigates operate in Allied waters. They conduct freedom of navigation patrols. They make port calls in countries where American credibility depends on the perception that the military serves the nation, not an individual. A Trump-class frigate pulling into Yokosuka or Bahrain or Naples would send a message that the admiral believed was strategically counterproductive. February 13th. The White House responds, not through official channels, through the President himself on Truth Social at 6:22 a.m. The Navy brass needs to remember who the boss is. I built this fleet. I ordered these ships. The Trump-class frigates will be the finest warships ever constructed. Any admiral who doesn't like it can retire. The post was viewed 40 million times in 6 hours. At the Pentagon, the reaction was silence. No official response, no press conference. Admiral Gallagher went to the National Military Command Center and spent the morning reviewing operational updates from the Fifth Fleet. But behind closed doors, phone lines burned. The Secretary of Defense, Michael Harlan, spent 3 hours in consecutive meetings with the service chiefs. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lawrence Crawford, called Gallagher directly and asked a simple question. How far are you willing to take this? Gallagher's answer, according to 2 officials briefed on the call, was precise. He would not resign over the issue. He would not make public statements, but he would not sign any order redesignating the class. If the Secretary of the Navy chose to do so independently, that was within civilian authority. But the CNO would not participate. This was a carefully calibrated position, not defiance, not compliance. A deliberate abstention that forced the civilian leadership to own the decision completely. The Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Rexford, was now in an impossible position. If he signed the redesignation order, he would alienate every senior admiral in the fleet. If he refused, he would defy the president. Rexford chose a third path. On February 15th, he requested a meeting at the White House, not with the president, with the White House Chief of Staff, Kevin Garrett. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. No notes were taken. No aides were present. What emerged from that meeting was a compromise. But calling it a compromise understates how carefully it was engineered. The lead ship of the frigate class would be redesignated USS Trump, FFG 63. The ship that was being built at Fincantieri Marinette Marine in Wisconsin, the ship that had been USS Constellation since 2020, would carry a new name. But the class designation would not change. The frigates would remain Constellation class, not Trump class. The distinction was precise and deliberate. Naming one ship for a president was unusual, but not unprecedented. Naming a class for a sitting president was. The compromise preserved the precedent while giving the White House its symbolic victory. There was a second element. The ships that had already been named, Congress, Chesapeake, Lafayette, would keep their names. Only the lead ship would change. And the naming advisory panel the White House had proposed was quietly dropped. February 18th. The president announced the compromise from the Roosevelt Room. He stood in front of an artist's rendering of the frigate and declared it the most powerful warship in its class anywhere in the world. He made no mention of the controversy, no mention of the CNO's memo, no mention of the word compromise. Admiral Gallagher was not present at the announcement. He was aboard USS Baton in the Arabian Sea, conducting an operational review of mine countermeasure readiness. His absence was noted by everyone who understood what it meant. The naming episode lasted 6 days, February 12th through the 18th. In the scope of the Iranian confrontation and the broader strategic challenges facing the Navy, it was a footnote. But footnotes have consequences. The first consequence was inside the Navy itself. The crew of the former USS Constellation, now USS Trump, faced an identity crisis that no training manual covers. Their ship's crest, designed with Constellation imagery and the motto "First and Finest," was now obsolete. New insignia had to be designed, approved, and distributed. Uniform patches had to be replaced. The ship's internal communication system, which displayed the vessel's name on every screen, had to be updated. These are small things, but on a warship, small things define culture. A sailor who signed up to serve on Constellation and now serves on Trump carries a different psychological relationship to the vessel. Some embrace it, some resent it, all notice. The second consequence was diplomatic. On March 3rd, the USS Trump was scheduled for a port call in Muscat, Oman, a critical Gulf ally whose cooperation was essential to the ongoing Iranian containment strategy. The Omani government, through back-channel communications, expressed concern that hosting a warship bearing the American president's name could be perceived as a political endorsement. The port call was quietly rescheduled to USS Chesapeake instead. One canceled port visit. That's all it took to validate Admiral Gallagher's diplomatic concern. The third consequence was congressional. Senator Maria Callaway of Virginia, chair of the Armed Services Committee, announced hearings on the politicization of military traditions. The hearings were scheduled for April 2026. Witnesses would include former secretaries of the Navy, retired admirals, and naval historians. The hearings hadn't happened yet, but their announcement alone changed the political calculus. Any future attempt to rename warships would now face congressional scrutiny before it reached the Pentagon. The fourth consequence was the most significant and the least visible. Inside the Pentagon, the naming episode created a template. Senior military officers learned that formal, written objections, even when leaked, could shift the political dynamics of a presidential directive. Admiral Gallagher's memo didn't stop the renaming, but it forced a compromise that preserved the Navy's institutional framework while conceding a symbolic point. That template would matter in the weeks ahead, because the Iranian confrontation was escalating, and the questions facing the Pentagon about rules of engagement, about targeting authority, about the acceptable risk to American lives, were far more consequential than what name appeared on a hull. March 2026, the Strait of Hormuz. 3 Constellation-class frigates were scheduled for deployment by 2028. The lead ship, now USS Trump, was still in construction. Her keel had been laid. Her hull was taking shape in a Wisconsin shipyard, 800 miles from the ocean. But in the Persian Gulf, the ships that were already there, Arleigh Burke destroyers, Ticonderoga cruisers, Nimitz-class carriers, operated under names that carried decades of institutional memory. USS Laboon, named for Captain John Laboon, a submarine officer who earned the Silver Star in World War II and later became a Navy chaplain. USS Philippine Sea, named for the 1944 battle that broke Japanese naval aviation. These names weren't chosen by presidents. They were chosen by the Navy, and the sailors who served beneath them understood something that no executive memorandum could override. A ship's name isn't a brand, it's a covenant between the crew and the vessel. between the present and the past, between the sailor standing watch at 2 in the morning and the name painted on the hull above the waterline. The controversy will fade. Political cycles move fast. The hearings will happen or they won't. The next administration may rename USS Trump or let it stand. But the 6 days in February 2026 exposed something that doesn't fade. The tension between civilian authority and military tradition is not a bug in the American system. It's a feature. The Constitution gives the president command of the military. 2 centuries of institutional culture give the military its identity. When those forces collide, the Republic has to negotiate. Sometimes the negotiation is clean. Sometimes it leaks. Sometimes it plays out on social media at 6 in the morning. But it happens every time. Because the alternative, a military that simply obeys without institutional memory, without tradition, without the willingness to put a 5-page memo on the secretary's desk, is not a military that any democracy should want. Admiral Gallagher never made a public statement about the naming dispute. He didn't need to. The memo spoke for itself. And inside the Pentagon, inside the wardrooms and ready rooms and CICs of every ship in the fleet, the message was received. The Navy remembers. The Navy endures. And the name on the hull, whichever name it is, carries the weight of every sailor who ever served beneath it. Comment tradition. If you believe warship names should stay with the Navy. Comment commander if you believe the president has every right to name the ships he ordered built. Subscribe to Navy Sea Power. Because the real power isn't in the name. It's in the fleet.